Picture waking up one morning and your legs simply do not answer the way they used to. No accident, no warning. That is how multiple sclerosis often introduces itself, and for the people who live with it, the scariest question is never about today. It is about 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Will they still be walking on their own? Will they still be able to hold a cup of coffee steady? Nobody can promise them an answer. Multiple sclerosis attacks the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, the wiring that carries every signal your body sends and receives. And it does this in a way that is maddeningly unpredictable. 2 people can get the exact same diagnosis in the exact same year, and 10 years later one of them is running marathons while the other needs a wheelchair. Why does the disease treat people so differently? Scientists know part of the answer lies in genetics, part of it in things you are exposed to over a lifetime. But here is what should surprise you. One of the things they keep circling back to is what people put on their dinner plate. In the last couple of decades, medicine has actually gotten remarkably good at one part of this disease. New treatments can calm down the sudden attacks, the flare-ups that used to blindside patients out of nowhere. That is a real win. But it left a much harder problem sitting right there, mostly untouched. Those drugs are good at stopping the fireworks. They are much less good at stopping the slow, quiet decline underneath. The disability that creeps in year after year, even when the attacks stop. The disability that is not one dramatic event, but 1,000 small losses added together. That part of the disease has remained stubbornly hard to touch. So researchers started asking a different kind of question. Not what new drug can we invent, but what is already sitting inside a person's daily life that might be quietly working for or against them. Diet kept coming up, not as a cure, nobody was claiming that, but as one of the few genuinely modifiable pieces of the puzzle. You cannot change your genes. You can change what is on your fork tonight. And a handful of smaller studies had already dropped some intriguing breadcrumbs. One study out of Italy found that people with multiple sclerosis who followed a Mediterranean-style diet, heavy on fish, tended to have less disability. Another found a link between eating fish or taking omega-3 supplements and lower disability scores. A separate study across Europe found a modest connection between higher fish intake and slower disease progression. Interesting clues, but every single one of them had the same weakness. They were snapshots, a single moment in time, comparing people who happened to eat differently. None of them could actually watch what happened next. Nobody had followed a large group of newly diagnosed patients for years, tracking their fish habits and their disability side by side, to see if the pattern held up once real time was allowed to pass. So here is a question worth sitting with for a second. What if the missing piece in slowing this disease down was not a new drug at all, but something as ordinary as what shows up on your plate twice a week? It sounds almost too simple. A disease that can take away someone's ability to walk. And the question is whether eating more salmon or cod might change that trajectory. Simple does not always mean wrong, though. Some of the biggest wins in medicine have come from unglamorous everyday habits, not miracle pills. Sleep, movement, what we eat. So a team decided to actually test this properly for the first time over the long run. Before we get to what they found, it helps to understand why fish specifically kept showing up as a suspect. Fish is not just protein. It carries a couple of ingredients that stand out for the nervous system. The first is omega-3 fatty acids, found mostly in oilier fish like salmon and mackerel. They are well known for calming inflammation, and inflammation is a big part of what drives multiple sclerosis in the first place. The second is less famous, taurine, an amino acid found richly in fish and seafood. Your brain actually uses taurine for its own protective work, defending cells against damage. Most people have never even heard of it. And there is a third suspect, one science is only starting to take seriously. What you eat reshapes the trillions of bacteria living in your gut, and that gut community talks constantly with your immune system. Change the diet, And you might be changing that conversation and, by extension, the inflammation reaching the brain and spinal cord. None of this proves anything on its own. It just explains why fish was worth a serious look. Now, back to the plate, because the real test was not just asking whether people who already ate a lot of fish did better. The real test was whether changing that habit, starting today, could still move the needle. And that meant tracking not just what people ate when they were first diagnosed, but whether they kept eating that way years later, or whether they'd changed course entirely, for better or worse. So picture a nationwide effort in Sweden, where health registries are unusually thorough. Researchers identified newly diagnosed multiple sclerosis patients and simply asked them, right at the start, how often do you eat fish? Lean white fish like cod and haddock. Oily fish like salmon and herring. Rarely, monthly, weekly, or close to daily. A simple question. And then they waited and watched for up to 15 years. If you like watching real, ordinary science quietly answer questions doctors have wondered about for years, hit subscribe. We go looking for a new one like this every week. Now, back to Sweden's 15-year fish experiment. 15 years is a long time in a person's life. Long enough for a disease to fully show its hand, for small differences at the start to turn into very different outcomes by the end. Every one of those patients was tracked through the country's medical system, with doctors regularly scoring how much disability had crept in, using the same standardized checkpoints every time, so the comparison stayed fair. And here is where it gets interesting, because life does not stay still for 15 years. Some people who barely touched fish at diagnosis started eating it regularly a few years later. Others went the opposite direction. So the researchers checked back in with everyone partway through, asking the same question again, giving them a second chance to see whether a change in habits actually tracked with a change in outcome. This is the part that makes the story worth telling. It was not just about who was born into good habits. It was about whether ordinary people, mid-diagnosis, mid-life, could still change their trajectory by changing their fork. Because if the answer was yes, that changes everything about how doctors might one day talk to patients on the very day they get this diagnosis. Not just here are your medications, but here is something else you control. So here is the real question the researchers were trying to answer. Does eating more fish actually change how fast multiple sclerosis takes away a person's mobility? Or is it just a habit that happens to travel alongside healthier people anyway? The people who ate the most fish, both lean and oily, several times a week, saw their risk of their disability getting measurably worse cut by roughly a third, compared with people who almost never ate it. That protection was not limited to one measurement either. It held up across several different checkpoints doctors use to track how much a person's mobility and daily function have declined, not just one lucky number. And it did not seem to matter much whether someone leaned toward oily fish, lean white fish, or both. People who ate both kinds regularly had the lowest risk of all, but even sticking to just one type helped some. That detail matters because it suggests the effect is not only about the fatty, oil-rich compounds everyone assumes fish is famous for. Something broader seems to be going on across fish in general. Now for the part that really got people's attention. Remember those patients who changed their habits partway through the study, years after their diagnosis? Their outcomes changed right along with them. People who went from rarely eating fish to eating it several times a week cut their risk of worsening by about a fifth. And the small group who made the most dramatic jump, from almost never to nearly daily, saw an even sharper drop. In other words, this was not just about the habits you were raised with. Patients who kept a high, steady fish intake all the way through the follow-up period showed the strongest protection of anyone in the study. It genuinely was not too late to start. That single detail is arguably the most useful thing in the entire study, because it turns this from a story about the past into a decision someone can make tonight. Naturally, the researchers had to ask an obvious follow-up question. Oily fish also happens to be one of the few natural food sources of vitamin D, and low vitamin D has its own separate reputation in this disease. So was fish just a stand-in for vitamin D all along? They checked, and the answer was no. Vitamin D levels barely changed the relationship between fish and disability, and on their own showed no clear pattern with how the disease progressed. Whatever fish was doing here, it was not simply working as a vitamin D delivery system. The effect stood largely on its own. Now, the one honest sentence that has to come with a story like this. This was not a trial where scientists handed fish to one group and nothing to another and watched what happened under controlled conditions. It was built on people's own reported habits over many years, and people who eat more fish may simply differ in other ways too. In resources, in other lifestyle choices, in things the study could not fully capture. Correlation is not the same thing as proof. The researchers say so themselves openly, and they are calling for exactly the kind of controlled follow-up trial that could nail this down for good. But weigh what is actually sitting on the table here. Close to 2,700 people, followed for up to 15 years, a pattern that held up not once, but across multiple checkpoints, and that moved when people's habits moved. That is a lot more than a passing coincidence. It is the kind of evidence that does not prove a diet cures a disease, but that makes a very reasonable case for keeping fish on the menu. Especially for someone who has just been told they have a disease, doctors still cannot fully predict, and who is looking for literally anything within their own control. So no, a weekly piece of salmon will not rewrite anyone's diagnosis. But 15 years of real patient data now points the same direction as those smaller studies that came before it, and this time the pattern held up. The people who kept fish on their plate consistently, year after year, walked away with the strongest protection anyone in this story found. And that is a habit almost anyone watching this could start tonight.